Good evening, everyone. Just a quick reminder that any questions, if we have time this evening for Q&A, each of you should have had an index card on your seat. There are both museum staff as well as Archdiocese staff stationed at the end of the aisle, so please feel free to pass your cards to the staff and we will be sure to get them to the moderator. It is my absolute honor and distinct pleasure to introduce to you both President of our museum and Holocaust survivor Fritzi Fritschall and Father Thomas Bema, Vicar of the Office of Interfaith and Ecumenical Affairs for the Archdiocese of Chicago. Fritzi and Father Bema.
So I guess I'm first, right? Okay, I don't like being first, but okay. So you've seen this film, and I think there can be a lot of discussions about the film. There can be a lot of discussions of what happened and what is the truth. And so I stand before you today to tell you what is the truth. I stand before you as a Holocaust survivor. So how do you deny something that happened? How do you deny something that happened to 6 million Jews and many, many others? How do you deny something that happened to 1.5 million babies while we survivors are still here and still alive and can still tell the story? You're in a Holocaust museum today. It is very, very important for you to know what is happening in this museum, why I am so involved. It is important for you to know the teachings that go on in this museum about the past. It is important for you to know that this museum was built by survivors so that the truth can be told to all of you. It is built so that you can be here and hear from us. I have seen this film years ago. I don't really remember it much, but I should have really seen it again before I stand up to speak. So we need to know that there is a lot of anti-Semitism going on today again, a lot of racism, a lot of prejudice. This is what we do best in this museum. We teach about the truth. We teach children. We teach so that they can go home and ask questions, so they can learn from us and they can learn from the past. So we're really, really lucky to have a museum like this today, so that all of you can come and learn and listen to all of us. There are not many survivors left. So my concern is, I'm still here today. I can still tell the story. What is going to happen to the stories about the Holocaust when the survivors are no longer here, when the deniers are going to stand up and talk? What is going to happen when the Ku Klux Klan gets its way again, because they're out there again raising their heads? It is scary to me, and it should be scary to you, and you should stand up, you should speak out, and you should always, always talk about the truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Fritzi. Well, good evening. As you've heard, I'm Father Thomas Bema, and so on behalf of the Archdiocese of Chicago, let me add my welcome to the one that you've just had from President Fritschall of the Holocaust Museum. I want to take you back to 1965 when something remarkable happened. It was the close of the Second Vatican Council, and with the decree on ecumenism and the declaration on the relationship of the Church to non-Christian religions, only shortly off the press, an administrative memorandum was written. It was issued providing a budget for the newly established Secretariat of Promoting Christian Unity and its Commission on Religious Relations with the Jews. One commentator, upon learning that, said with surprise, "Wow, they gave dialogue a budget. They must be serious." Well, some years later, not too many, just a very few years later, a similar memorandum was written in the Archdiocese of Chicago, establishing a similar office. Today, the Archdiocesan Office for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs institutionalizes the commitments of Cardinal Cupich and his predecessors to make dialogue the means of our engagement with the other religious communities of Chicagoland. Ideas need institutions to carry them out. The Illinois Holocaust Museum is such an institution at the service of an idea. We are grateful to President Fitzgerald and to CEO Susan Abrams, Director of Education Kelly Zaney, for partnering with us on this important program. I also want to thank Paula Waters, Dr. Daniel Olson, along with Grant Galicio and the staff of the Archdiocese for the incredible amount of work they did to make tonight possible. As religious people, truth is our business. As people concerned about the health and well-being of our country, there's no monopoly on a concern for truth. And as people who believe that dialogue is the path towards harmony among people, truth is a necessary quality of communication. Said another way, truth matters because it's the basis for knowledge and the medium for trust. We're here tonight because the idea of truth is under attack. Tonight's program is all about demonstrating why truth matters. I'm grateful to see many of our fellow travelers with the Archdiocese's Catholic-Jewish dialogues. Let me briefly acknowledge the Jewish institutions who are part of one of the longest-running formal dialogue programs in the United States of America. They are the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the Chicago Board of Rabbis, the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, and Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership. Along with the Illinois Holocaust Museum, this represents an institutional partnership between Catholics and Jews unparalleled virtually anywhere else in the world. It also represents the vital context in which this program takes place tonight. My final and enjoyable task is to introduce our distinguished panel. E.J. Dionne Jr. is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, and university professor in the Foundation of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University. A nationally known and respected commentator on politics, Dionne appears weekly on National Public Radio and regularly on MSNBC. He has also appeared on NewsHour with James Lehrer and other PBS programs. Dionne began his career at the New York Times, where he spent 14 years reporting on local and state government, national politics, and from around the world, including stints in Paris, Rome, and Beirut. The Los Angeles Times praised his coverage of the Vatican as the best in 2 decades. In 1990, Dionne joined the Washington Post as a reporter covering national politics and began writing his column in 1993. His best-selling book, Why Americans Hate Politics, was published in 91. This book, which Newsday called a classic in American political history, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and a National Book Award nominee. His latest book, One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported, with Thomas Mann and Norman Orstein, is published in 2017. Rabbi Samuel Gordon leads Sukkat Shalom in Wilmette. He was ordained at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and also holds an MBA degree from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. In 2005, he was awarded the Doctor of Divinity degree from Hebrew Union College. He is a former vice president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Rabbi Gordon's a member of the President's Advisory Council of the Hebrew Union College and a senior rabbinic fellow of the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He previously served as a trustee for the Reformed Pension Board, Chicago Theological Seminary, and the Kishki School. In 2013, President Barack Obama appointed Rabbi Gordon as a member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. He was reappointed to the council in 2017. And in 2015, the Jewish Forward listed him as one of America's most inspiring rabbis. Cardinal Blase Cupich is the Archbishop of Chicago. As Archbishop, he pastors the third largest archdiocese in the USA. He currently serves the Holy Father as a member of the Congregation for Bishops and the Congregation for Catholic Education. Cardinal Cupich also serves on the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs, where he's the co-chair of the National Catholic-Muslim Dialogue. Also on the subcommittee for the Church in Central and Eastern Europe, and on the ad hoc committee on racism. He's an executive member of the Catholic Mutual Relief Society and chancellor of both the Catholic Church Extension Society and the University of St. Mary the Lake in Mundelein. Ordained a priest of the Archdiocese of Omaha, he was pastor of 2 parishes in Omaha. He served as secretary at the Apostolic Nunciature in Washington, D.C., and led the Pontifical College Josephinum as its rector and president. He was ordained a bishop in 1998, serving as Bishop of Rapid City in South Dakota, Bishop of Spokane in Washington, and now as Archbishop of Chicago. He was also the chair for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on the Protection of Children and Youth, and the National Catholic Educational Association. In 2016, Pope Francis named him to the College of Cardinals. Cardinal Cupich did his undergraduate studies at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, his seminary and graduate studies at the Pontifical North American College and the Gregorian University in Rome, and his postdoctoral studies at the Catholic University of America, where he received a Doctor of Sacred Theology degree. He's been awarded honorary doctorates from Boston College and the University of Notre Dame. It is with gratitude and pleasure that I present this panel to you for tonight's discussion.
Father, I want to thank you for integrity and courage, because you gave Rabbi Gordon and me introductions equally generous to those that you gave to your boss. So that was awfully nice of you. And I also want to say for myself personally, it was so much nicer than an introduction I once got, which ended, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. So bless you for that. I really want to salute Fritzi, if I may. We just had the great honor and pleasure of having dinner with her, of talking to her, and then of seeing her in the exhibit. I don't know how many of you have seen Fritzi and her hologram. And I think that bearing witness is a blessed act on behalf of both truth and solidarity. And she says in her presentation that she promised to speak on behalf of the 600 women she worked with in a slave labor camp, and she's kept that obligation. And we salute you, Fritzi. And I also want to say I'd rather be governed by Fritzi's hologram than a lot of people I can think of. So thank you very, very much. That was an extraordinary movie, and there were so many moments in it that I want to sort of pick up on. But in a way, I want to begin with the words that became famous recently from America's mayor. That would, truth isn't truth, discuss. And that's actually a serious question. Before we start anything else, I really would like each of you to talk about your sense of what truth is, what our obligations to it are, how we misunderstand what truth is, and how we lose it. And I know, Rabbi, we were talking before, you had a very interesting take on difference between facts and truth. So why don't I start with you?
Well, thank you. Thank you. There we go. thank
Oh,
you
I didn't have a
for-
mic. Oh, I've
you
got this.
have
So,
a mic.
so you can, yeah.
You're mic'd. Thank you for the honor of being able to be here also with His Eminence and with you. Oftentimes, as a rabbi, as a biblical scholar, people come up, particularly children, and ask, well, did that really happen? Did the Red Sea part? Was there an Abraham? Was there a Moses? Did it happen? Is it true? And I will often say, well, it may not be fact, but it's truth. And the example given is George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. That didn't happen, but it's truth. It teaches us something extraordinarily important, both about George Washington, that he didn't tell a lie, and about us who tell the story, because it represents our values, what we would like our presidents to be, what we like our leadership to represent. There are things that may never have happened, but are truth. Now, I want to be very careful in saying that, because the Holocaust is a fact as well as a truth. But it doesn't matter whether there were 6,000,001 or 5,999,000 who perished. That's not what makes the Holocaust important for us to know and understand. Its truth is that something horrific happened to other human beings, perpetrated by human beings. And our learning the lesson from that is ultimately the truth.
Archbishop.
I wanted to express my gratitude too to being with both of you here today. And the Rabbi really, I think, gives a wonderful insight about this notion of truth and fact. The way I come at this issue of truth is in terms of relationships. You need truth in order to have relationships between human beings. It shows respect. It shows that there is a understanding that the other person that you're relating to is someone who you're able to enter into dialogue and a relationship with. And if you don't have that, then relationships break down. Think of a marriage where there's not truth. It kills the relationship. Also in society, when in fact truth is not there as part of our existence, the fabric of society shreds, and we become not a united people. So for me, truth is a very important aspect for human relationships to survive. It's, in a way, it's the oxygen of human relationships and human society. And whenever we ignore that, something in humanity, something in our relationships and our unity dies and doesn't exist. That's why it's so important for me.
Can I sort of press you on the fact question? Because we have just seen in this movie the dangers of denying fact. And so while I think you're entirely right in your story about the Red Sea, the loss of the existence, shall we say, of alternative facts, the claim that certain things that fact becomes simply a matter of opinion is very, very dangerous. And in a way, that's what was on trial in that movie. Are we in some kind of danger in this period of creating on a much larger scale the problem that we just saw in that movie, and where does that come from?
Well, I think one of the things that we saw in the movie was that there was an agenda behind the denial and manipulation of truth, that there was a specific agenda. And we have to look at that agenda of David Irving. And I think that's why David Irving lost that case. I mean, I'm not an attorney, but it seems to me that that was one of the messages of the movie, that when they determined why he was manipulating the story, the narrative, it was a question of, well, was it something he really believed, and was there some level of possibility that it wasn't true? But once they determined what his agenda was, I think it clarified what was going on behind his use of the lie. And it goes back to Hitler himself and the big lie. And saying a lie often enough allows somebody to believe it. And we're seeing that today in terms of people really wondering, well, maybe it isn't true. Maybe there's some truth to this lie. And I think that's what's really so dangerous.
And Archbishop Cupich, Cardinal Cupich, you commented on a line in the movie that really struck with you when the judge said, is it a lie if he believes it?
Right. Yeah. When the judge said that, I wondered, since I hadn't seen the movie and wasn't familiar with the story so much, I was wondering if it was going to go the other way. Is it a lie if he doesn't believe it? And I think that at the end of the movie, I got my answer to that question when David Irving was on television and proclaimed that he had won. Stunning, of course. But then the answer to that question, is it a lie if you believe it, is yes, because he wasn't just a liar. He was a lie. His life was a lie. And it was because I think the judge was able to see that that was what had to be denounced. His life as a lie. And so for me, that was those two moments really were bookends of the same truth that was there. In a way, when you lie so much and you become the lie, your life is dehumanized. There's a dehumanization that takes place to the person, but also in a society. I was, years ago when I was taking a German course, had a German teacher, and he showed us an era during the Nazi regime, and how people were so taken up with Hitler and his diatribes and his speeches and so on, and because it was almost comical, but some of the students began to laugh, and after the film was over, the German teacher had tears in his eyes. He said, "I know it looked funny." But he said, we lived to that, and this man robbed our soul as a nation. We were dehumanized in all of this. So that is the power of a lie. It diminishes our humanity.
The temptations to draw everything too close to contemporary politics are enormous, and I'm mostly going to try to resist them. Although, please don't resist them when you write down your questions. There's another line in the movie that really struck me when Deborah Lipstadt said, "Denial is a pick to open the door to something else." And I was thinking about the many something else's that she was talking about. In this case, obviously, it was, among other things, the legitimation of anti-Semitism, of racism, of white supremacy, of ethno-nationalism. I feel like a professor giving an open-ended essay question, which are a real pain in the neck for students, but I can't resist. What do you make of denial is a pick to open the door to something else?
Question is, as a professor, are you going to grade my blue book?
I am a professor, and I'm a really easy grader, so you don't have to
That's
worry
good.
about that.
Those are the classes I always look for.
A great story, if I can. Paul Wellstone, who's somebody I deeply admired, once told me, the senator from Minnesota, and he was a professor, and he said so many of his students had worked for his campaign, and he said especially students to whom I gave A's, And then he smiled and said, I was a really easy grader. So, go ahead, Rabbi.
Well, we just observed the 1-year anniversary of Charlottesville. So and of course this movie came out before that, and David Irving came out before that, but some of our shock was that in our country, and last year I spoke about this at the holidays, and thinking about my father on Omaha Beach, the concept that that in this country there would be a march of Nazis as Nazis and willing to speak and say blood and soil, and Jews will not replace us, and you will not replace us. Denial is an opening not on the issue of is history true or not, or factual or not, but if you deny the reality of history, then it gives you the opportunity to bring out all the worst instincts of human behavior, because not only are we not learning from history, but we're denying the reality of history. And Charlottesville a year ago was a perfect example of opening up that door that has allowed that. And it's very frightening.
And we're very aware of that sitting in this building in this town, given the history of this place that we're in.
To take it into another venue, there are now deniers, and somebody is in court over this, about the shooting in Sandy Hook. And here you have parents who are reliving the pain of losing a child slaughtered by guns that should not be in society. And there is that picking of a lock to protect gun dealers, high-powered weapons. And so we see this all the time. The truth is subverted for financial gain, for whatever it is. But to me, that's an example of the kind of denial that's taking place even in our time on some social issues.
I've worked for newspapers for a long time, so I'm inviting you to attack the press if you want. I was another little fact in the movie. I don't know how many of you noticed this, but there was, in Britain, newspapers announce themselves on these posters, and they say what the story in the paper was. And the day after that terrible day in the trial, when they thought everything was going the wrong way, the headline in that box was "No holes, no Holocaust." And then when you got to the end of the movie and he lost, the statement in the box is he lied. And what struck me about that is, I do believe journalism should actually be about truth. However, what you see is journalism reports the story that it's given on a given day. And that day, the classic headline was "No holes, no Holocaust." So what do both of you feel about the mediation of truth through the news process, and maybe also talk about social media? I would have loved to see what that movie would have looked like with Facebook and Twitter, and I imagine that David Irving's theories are thriving in parts of social media, no matter what happened in that trial. But what about this mediation? And both of you have been in public, and Archbishop, you have been very much in public in your job, and so you've watched this process go on. Why don't I start with you? The mediation process.
Well, yes, you're right. I think I expect from journalism, especially, that they see themselves as an art. And by that I mean I take that saying of Paul Klee, the art historian and artist himself, who said, art doesn't give us something to see, it makes us see. And I think that the media has to make us see things, not just give us something to see. They have to present what's happening there in the world in a way that opens our eyes. And that's part of truth-telling too, it seems to me. So that would be my expectation of your profession.
I've never felt so ennobled to be compared with Paul Klee, but it doesn't always work that way.
But EJ does that, in the columns he writes. A good columnist, David Brooks is another one. He writes in such a way that forces us to see something that we otherwise would have missed. And that is a very, very important contribution in a free society. In that expression, and instead of this business of the Twitter world we live in, where it's kind of like a drive-by shooting. You get all of this stuff out there that doesn't hang together and doesn't make us see anything other than get at our visceral reaction out of us. That I think is so very damaging to society.
Rabbi, why don't you take it? And I've always been interested in the problem of journalism because, it's in a way that headline, no holes, no Holocaust, was a bit like the McCarthy era, where a lot of reporters would scribble down in their little old reporters' notebooks what Joe McCarthy said. And whether it was true or not, it was good copy. And whether it was 200 communists one day and 150 the next day, it would roll on and on. Could you talk about that sort of danger?
I think there's always been a danger with a selective reading of journalism. Anyone who's been interviewed by a journalist at any time looks back at the quotes and says, did I say that? Or how did you edit it down to that or get that message? And so there's always been a question that journalists, good journalists, have their own agenda as well. They're human beings. I think right now, and this is somewhat trite, I think we've heard this many, many times, that not only with social media, but with narrowcasting as opposed to broadcasting, and with everyone watching their own version of the news, whether I'm watching PBS, there's a plug for you, or CBS or NBC, or someone watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, we're getting the news we want to hear. Then you add in social media, and you add in people like InfoWars, and what was done in terms of Sandy Hook and the Parkland students being called actors. It's really also up to all the other institutions, the educational institutions especially, and the home, to teach how to read with interpretation and listen with interpretation and understand what is true and what's not, and when you're being manipulated, and when a whole society is being manipulated by a lie. And that's back to McCarthyism. The society believed it, and it's back to Germany. The Germans believed the lie. And having been to Germany a number of times, I feel that of all places in the world, in Europe certainly, the one nation that has tried to grapple with the reality of the Holocaust has been the Germans. And trying to teach their own children the evil that was perpetrated in their name. I think it takes all the institutions, not just journalism, to deal with the issue of what is reality, what's truth, what are our values, what are our true values, and how to continue teaching those values and teaching the ability to walk through the manipulation and to cut through that and to see what is true.
I want to ask you a question that's not about the truth, but about a choice that people have to make all the time in politics that was really illustrated in a powerful way in this movie. And I am not sure, as in a way, I want you to put your moral philosopher's hat on. It was really striking the moment that Deborah Lipstadt said to the Holocaust survivor, "The voice of suffering will be heard." And she felt that she had a moral obligation to call up Holocaust survivors to tell their stories. And then her lawyer says not doing that is the price you pay for winning. And there is an exchange in the movie where she says, "This is everything I thought I would never do," and the lawyer called it heroically an act of self-denial. And so I came away, I don't know how many of you felt this way, but I came away debating with myself what was actually the right call. Now, in the end, she won, and the scene is joyous, and the Holocaust survivors feel vindicated in some way, even though their voice wasn't heard. But what was her moral obligation? How did you play with that as you were watching it? And I found myself still torn at the end of the movie because I was very grateful that she won. The lawyers were right. Her lawyer managed to tell some of the story, but she did not keep her promise in a fundamental way to that person, she said. And I think it was just an amazing little parable on ends and means in politics, more broadly. What were your reflections thinking about that aspect of the movie?
I thought that her solicitor was right on, because in the end, it's true, the stories were not told, but his story was. His lie was. And that was more important to reveal, because in fact it did not allow for all the other stories to be told and to be understood. So I believe that he chose the greater good here, that it was more important for his story to be exposed rather than for their individual stories to be told.
I just want to say something about Cardinal Cupich. I've known him now for a long time. One of the things I always liked about him is that he's a fighter, and I tend to agree with the things he fights for, and he just proved that to you right here. Rabbi, how did you react to that question?
Well, much the same way. This was a legal issue, and this was a courtroom drama movie. What it ended up doing was demonstrating that David Irving was not an historian. And so in the field of academics, he lost that battle as well. He no longer had any credibility, and Deborah Lipstadt did. And it's Deborah Lipstadt's job as an historian to speak for the victims. But in this movie, it was the lawyer's job, the solicitor's job, to win the case. And that eventually allowed David Irving to lose any stature, if he had any, as an historian.
So the men of the cloth say you got to win, and here I am sitting morally troubled by all of this. I will have to. Thank you. You're probably right too, but go ahead.
Cubs.
I'm a Red Sox fan, and we are winning, although not the last few days. I want to ask a theological question, and it turns out there's a writer who had a great impact on me when I was young, Richard Rubinstein, who was a death of God theologian, wrote a very famous book called After Auschwitz. He also wrote another book about the Holocaust called The Cunning of History. And the reason he became a death of God theologian is because he really felt after the Holocaust, God had died. And he he quoted Camus' line that we stand in a cold, silent, unfeeling cosmos, unaided by any purposeful power beyond ourselves. It's a pretty dark view. It's not a believer's view. It turned out the rabbi studied with Richard, he was his rabbi. Richard Rubinstein was. I do think Rubinstein posed a genuine question, which is where was God in the Holocaust, and how can one think about God after the Holocaust?
Well, up until this evening when you talked about Richard Rubinstein, who I've been in touch with over the years, he was, as child, the rabbi of my congregation. He was the Hillel rabbi of the University of Pittsburgh, and I was then a student at University of Pittsburgh. He taught French existentialism, in addition to...
No wonder you like Camus.
Right, yeah. Right, absolutely. And maybe, if you want to do a little of analysis of me, my initial statement about truth and fact is based on a little bit on Rubinstein's deciding that God was dead after the Holocaust. And so I would say that there's no factual proof of God. And maybe my own theology is that there is a truth of God. And that I had not connected these two together before, but when I talk about knowing what is truth, it can sometimes be greater than what you can prove as fact. You can't prove God. Rubinstein was saying that a Holocaust, if God allowed it to happen, was proof that God didn't exist. But I think Rubinstein was looking for a factual God as opposed to the truth of God.
I don't have anything to add to that.
You didn't have Rubinstein as your rabbi.
There are a series of questions from the audience. We've got on 3 different cards that all point in the same direction. So let me read all of these questions together. This allows you to skip the really hard one, but actually they're all very closely related. And this is interesting. How do we silence someone like Irving? Which I would follow up by saying, is that what we should do? The other question is, how should we deal with the idea of alternative facts and multiple truths? And to that I'd append, I think there's a difference between alternative facts and multiple truths. But I think that's one good question. Related in an era of alternative facts and when truth is not truth, what do we hold on to and what guides us to truth? Besides rabbis and archbishops, that wasn't there. And then lastly, how do we teach the truth in a post-truth alternative facts society? I think all those questions are getting at broadly the same thing. Do you want to start there since you allowed the rabbi to sort of take care of the last one?
I'm going to go to that first one that you had here because that was the one about how do we... I'm sorry. The one
you
about,
silence him by shutting off his microphone.
Yeah, silence it, yeah. How do you silence him? I think by letting him speak and exposing him to what the ridiculous charge that he would have. I think it's there's nothing. I'm not in favor of this business of not having people allowed to speak at different places. Then they have to be held accountable for what they say. So I'm not at all for silencing people or saying they can't speak. But then they should be willing to be exposed for what they're saying, and that takes people ready to stand up and say that. So that's the best way to silence people, is to have the voices of other people, not shout them down, but call them into accountability.
I agree with you, and I want to press you anyway. First of all, she says that in the movie. When she says she's not trying to shut people down. She says what you can't expect is to lie and not to be held accountable for it, which I thought was a really good formula. But in this era that we live in now, it is very easy to live in a world in which my lie is never, you never hear the refutation if I were to lie. Because you're listening to me and to people who agree with me. God forbid I lie. But that if you are listening to a liar and the lies are reinforced, the truth doesn't catch up for a very significant number of people because my friend David Brooks likes the fancy phrase epistemic closure, and that people live in kind of closed universes. So how do we deal with that? Because ideally, we have an open society, people hear all the arguments, and then they get to see when a lie is a lie. What do we do in this world? And that exists in the Catholic Church. I mean, we see that in the debates within the Church, where there are sort of websites that have a very particular view of the Pope and the Church, and you. Precisely. How do you deal with that? There are people out there who probably have no idea what you really believe because they only read those websites.
Well, I saw John Kerry today, and he maybe it was in our earlier interview, and he talked about his relationship with John McCain, and he said we didn't trust each other, and so we didn't have any discussion, but as soon as we got to know each other on a human level, we were able then to break down the silos that we were living in that didn't allow us to talk and to dialogue. And that really, I think, is what is key today. There's the polarization that we have in the country, in our churches, in our communities, is due to the fact that we are living in our own silos, and we don't trust each other. And that I think has to be the first base of how we really get at truth that comes in dialogue. That trust of each other, that putting aside fear of each other, I think is so very key for us. But there's a lot of fear in the country, not just polarization, distrust and fear, and that's what's so troubling to me.
Rabbi, on this whole collection of questions, alternative truth and the like.
Well, I have many of those same fears and concerns about the polarization of our country and our inability to talk to each other, and John McCain of blessed memory really is a wonderful example of that, and the fact that Barack Obama and George W. Bush are going to be giving his eulogies, the two men who defeated him, and the two men who ran against each other too, somehow coming together. I think that says something. And I don't want to build on the divisiveness, but again, after a year after Charlottesville, when that same group tried to come in Washington and couldn't get 24 people gathered, they didn't need to be shouted down, even though there were thousands there to shout them down. Part of, I think, what the last couple years has shown us is that passivity on behalf of those who are struggling for equality and justice and integrity in this country. People can't be passive anymore. And when the shock of Charlottesville happened, it's because and Parkland, and having to take high school kids who in the course of a little over a month were able to organize demonstrations of 500,000 people, that, at least for an optimist, that provides some hope. And I realize that could be divisive too, because there are plenty of people on the other side of that. But there's more people are more engaged right now, I think, in the life of the political life, or the social life, the cultural life of our country than they have been. And passivity, and back to not being upstanders, I think that era has to have ended.
John McCain had a wonderful sense of humor, often self-deprecating, and he once was commenting on politics, he said, look, things are always dark before they go completely black. And what's interesting is he was basically a hopeful man. But this is one specifically directed to Cardinal Cupich. Why do you believe Holocaust deniers are vocal? That they truly believe it, they want to be loud and noticed, they want to have it proven beyond doubt that it happened, or it's uncomfortable to accept that a whole group of people were so inhumane as to want to destroy the Jewish nation. Those are the four on the card. Obviously, the other one is, are there a lot of anti-Semites out there? Mm-hmm. And if I could sort of add to that, are we experiencing a new rise of anti-Semitism in the West in this period, to both of you?
I believe that David Irving came at this not because he wanted to be some unique historian where he, found some new historical fact that needed to be proclaimed to the world, or that he had some other kind of agenda to sell books, but it was because of a deep-seated bigotry. That's what drove him. He didn't care what the truth was as long as his bigotry could be fomented. And that for me, that's the issue. That's why people do these, why there are deniers. At the bottom is a deep-seated hatred for Jewish people. It's a hatred, it's a fear based on falsehoods, maybe learned from other people or cultivated in their own hearts, but it's a hatred. And that hatred will drive people to do anything in order for them to achieve their goal. That's it's not just anti-Semitism in terms of being prejudicial. We have to uncover that as hatred that destroys that person.
Rabbi, and what is your take on whether we are, in fact, in the West in particular, experiencing, by which I'm including Europe, a new wave of anti-Semitism? Is there something about our distance from the Holocaust as time goes on, anti-Semitism becomes more possible, more acceptable, that there has, precisely because of what the Nazis did, there was a kind of mass realization in the West of the profound costs and brutality of anti-Semitism? Are we forgetting those lessons?
Well, clearly we are 70 years away from the Holocaust. And as Fritzi and others know, the eyewitnesses are fewer and fewer. And I'm going to give you just my personal bias. I think anti-Semitism is, people have always said that the Jews are the canaries in the mine, that we are hypersensitive to prejudice, and that we may feel it first. But what's going on right now is not just anti-Semitism. It is an anti-otherness. It has to do with the response to immigration. In Europe, certainly, and here in America. When I keep going back to Charlottesville, there is a white supremacist movement that includes everyone who is not, in the minds of the white supremacist, the proper American in their own estimation. And that includes Catholics, it includes the immigrants, it includes people of color, and it certainly includes Jews. And it is the otherness that is the great prejudice of the world. And we're seeing it in Western Europe, we're seeing it in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, and in other places. And much of that is a response to a changing world. I should also say, in the otherness, I want to include women and LGBTQ people. There's a fear that, at least in America, that America is being taken over by these groups of others. And it's all encompassing. And so anti-Semitism is only a piece of it in my mind. And it may be perhaps a first example, but we see it frighteningly throughout society in the East and West.
And now, especially in the immigration debate today, the policy of the present administration is to make sure that officially people are not called undocumented, but illegal aliens. That pigeonholes people right away, that they are other, they're aliens. That kind of language is totally inappropriate for us as a nation of immigrants.
I want to say what a great honor it was to be here at the museum and to be with these two distinguished people, my old friend, Cardinal Cupich, and my new friend, the Rabbi. And never again is something we rightly say about the Holocaust, but it seems to me the driving question ought to be, how do we make sure that it never happens again? How do we stay alert? How do we read the signs of the times? And how do we not become indifferent? I think that the Holocaust teaches us about the human capacity for brutality rooted in bigotry, but also brutality rooted in conformity and brutality rooted in indifference. And I pray that as a nation, as a world, we can learn how to avoid each of those. And I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
So Susan and I are standing here, and we want to thank the audience for being here this evening. Thank you so much for taking the time and coming here this evening. And I would like to thank EJ, the Rabbi, and Cardinal Cupich. Do you remember the first time we met? Yeah. I walked up to you and I said, how does one introduce themselves, or how does one say hello to a cardinal? That's how smart I am. And the cardinal, as nice as he is, looked at me and took my hand and very quietly said, "You just did." And so, thank you so much.
Thank you. To have three such leaders, three such deep and challenging thinkers to share their evening with us has been a real treat. You have given us a lot to continue to chew on. And with that, thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Well, EJ, you gotta take this on the road.
Thanks. You're still on. Thank you. If I may.
He's still on.
Your microphone's still on.
Oh, that's the bombing starts in 15.